Professor Krelix adjusted his 6 pairs of spectacles with practiced precision, each lens designed to focus on a different spectrum of light. His beetle-like carapace gleamed under the artificial suns of Lecture Hall 7, and his mandibles clicked in that particular rhythm that meant he was about to launch into another one of his famously dry dissertations. Today, class, we shall examine the fascinating topic of apex predators across our diverse galaxy, he announced, his voice carrying the sort of academic authority that could put a hyperactive Zephyrian crystal being to sleep. Who can tell me the primary characteristics that define an apex predator? 3 appendages shot up immediately. Well, 2 appendages and 1 tentacle, if we're being technically accurate, which Professor Krelix always was. Veltire, please proceed, he said, nodding toward the shimmering crystalline student in the 3rd row. Veltar's form pulsed with a soft blue light, the Zephyrian equivalent of clearing one's throat. An apex predator sits at the top of its food chain, possessing superior hunting capabilities, advanced sensory systems, and typically impressive physical attributes such as size, speed, or natural weaponry. Excellent. Florp? The gelatinous mass that was Florp quivered nervously before responding, in a voice like pudding being stirred. They also demonstrate advanced intelligence and strategic thinking capabilities, and usually exhibit territorial behaviors to maintain their dominance over hunting grounds. Very good. And Grunt? The massive Thrukian warrior, whose idea of whispering could shatter glass, rumbled his response. Apex predators crush enemies with superior battle tactics and overwhelming force. Professor Krelix's antennae twitched slightly. Yes, well, perhaps with slightly less volume next time, but the essence is correct. It was at this exact moment that the lecture hall doors burst open with all the subtlety of a supernova, and Jake Murphy stumbled in. His uniform was wrinkled. There was what appeared to be coffee stained across his chest in a pattern that vaguely resembled a small explosion, and his hair looked like he'd been personally introduced to a black hole. Sorry, Jake mumbled, sliding into the nearest empty seat with the kind of practiced grace that comes from being late to everything important in life. Traffic was murdered, literally. There was this whole thing with a Gloraxian transport and some kind of territorial dispute with a flock of void eagles, and honestly, I'm just lucky to be here. Professor Krelix's compound eyes focused on the human with the sort of expression typically reserved for examining particularly puzzling specimens. Mr. Murphy, how thoughtful of you to join us. We were just discussing the defining characteristics of apex predators. Ooh, cool, Jake said, pulling out a tablet that looked like it had been through a small war. What'd I miss? Perhaps, Professor Krelix said, his mandibles clicking with barely contained academic irritation, you could contribute the human perspective on what makes an apex predator. Jake glanced around the room, taking in the expectant faces, tentacles, and various other anatomical features of his classmates. He scratched his head, which only made his hair situation worse, and shrugged. Usually poor life choices. The silence that followed was the kind of silence typically found in the vacuum of space, complete and absolute. Veltar's crystalline form stopped pulsing entirely. Florp had somehow managed to become even more gelatinous with shock. Even Grunt, whose emotional range generally extended from mildly aggressive to catastrophically violent, seemed at a loss for words. Professor Krelix blinked all 6 pairs of eyes in sequence. I beg your pardon. Poor life choices, Jake repeated, as if this were the most obvious thing in the galaxy. I mean, think about it. What really makes something an apex predator? It's not just being big or having sharp teeth. It's the willingness to make absolutely terrible decisions and somehow survive them long enough to reproduce. The classroom erupted into what could generously be called academic discourse, but more accurately resembled the sound of a malfunctioning universal translator having an argument with itself. Veltar's crystalline structure flared bright red, the Zephyrian equivalent of indignation. It is completely illogical, Veltar declared, their voice ringing like struck glass. Apex predators are defined by evolutionary advantages, not by what you humans call poor judgment. Jake leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously under the abuse. Are they, though? I mean, sure, you can memorize all the textbook definitions you want, but when was the last time any of your species voluntarily did something that had a 90% chance of killing you just because it seemed fun? Florp made a sound like a wet balloon deflating. Why would anyone do that? That goes against every survival instinct in the galaxy. Exactly my point, Jake said, gesturing with his coffee-stained sleeve. Most species evolved to avoid danger. Humans evolved to high-five it and ask if it wanted to grab drinks later. Professor Krelix's mandibles were clicking rapidly now, which his students had learned was either a sign of deep thought or the early stages of a nervous breakdown. Mr. Murphy, while your perspective is unique, I hardly think you can argue that humans qualify as apex predators based on poor decision-making alone. Oh, we're not apex predators? Jake's eyebrows rose in what could charitably be called surprise. That's interesting. I mean, we're literally sitting in a space station that we built by strapping ourselves to controlled explosions and shooting ourselves off our home planet because we got bored, but sure, let's go with not apex predators. Grunt, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly leaned forward with interest. Human makes valid point about explosion writing. Thank you, Grunt. See, even the professional warrior gets it. Veltar's form pulsed with agitated energy. One species engaging in dangerous behavior does not make them apex predators. You lack the physical attributes, the natural weapons, the evolutionary advantages that define true apex status. Jake took a sip from a beverage container that looked suspiciously like it might have been repurposed from a chemical storage unit. Physical attributes, huh? Natural weapons? Tell me, Veltar, when your species encounters something dangerous, what do you do? We analyze the threat, calculate optimal survival strategies, and implement the safest course of action. Right. And when humans encounter something dangerous, we poke it with a stick to see what happens. The silence returned, heavier this time. Even the air recycling system seemed to pause in disbelief. Professor Krelix adjusted his spectacles nervously. Mr. Murphy, surely you don't mean to suggest that reckless behavior is a survival advantage? I'm not suggesting it, Professor. I'm stating it as established fact. And I can prove it. Jake stood up, nearly knocking over his chair in the process. Give me 15 minutes, and I'll demonstrate why humans are not just apex predators, but possibly the most terrifyingly effective apex predators in the known galaxy. Veltar's crystalline form flared brighter. Very well, human. I accept your challenge. But when you fail to provide adequate evidence, you will acknowledge that your species is merely another collection of slightly above-average mammals with delusions of grandeur. Deal, Jake said, extending his hand for a shake, before remembering that Zephyrians found physical contact roughly as appealing as a plasma burn. This is going to be fun. Professor Krelix made a note in his tablet. Something told him he was going to need to update his lesson plan. Possibly his insurance policy, too. Jake cracked his knuckles, which produced a sound that made Florp visibly recoil. All right, class. Let's start with something simple. A little place on Earth we call Australia. Australia? Professor Krelix consulted his datapad. According to our files, that's one of your planet's major continental landmasses, surely a relatively standard biosphere. Oh, Professor, Jake said with the kind of smile typically associated with people who were about to ruin everyone's day. Australia is what happens when evolution gets really, really angry and decides to take it out on everything that moves. It's a continent-sized death trap that somehow convinced 30 million humans to call it home. Veltar's crystalline form shifted skeptically. Surely you exaggerate. Do I? Let's see. Australia has spiders the size of dinner plates that can jump 6 feet. It has snakes so venomous that just thinking about them wrong can put you in the hospital. There are jellyfish that are literally transparent, death floating in the water, and octopi that can kill you with their bare tentacles. Flort made a sound like jello being violently stirred. And humans choose to live there. Live there? We turned it into a tourist destination. People pay money to visit Australia. They go swimming with the murder jellyfish. They take guided tours to see the deadly snakes. There are literally vacation packages that advertise, "Come see our terrifying wildlife up close." Professor Krelix's antennae were twitching rapidly. Surely the human government must have implemented extensive safety protocols. Jake laughed, which somehow made the situation worse. The safety protocol is a tourist brochure that basically says, everything here can kill you, have fun. And you know what humans did when they found out their continent was trying to murder them? They threw barbecues. They invented something called beach volleyball, and played it right next to the ocean, full of things with more teeth than a horror movie. This cannot be accurate, Veltar protested. No intelligent species would voluntarily inhabit an environment actively hostile to their survival. Oh, it gets better. Australians don't just live with the deadly wildlife. They've turned fighting it into a national sport. They have people whose job title is literally crocodile wrestler. There are humans who catch the venomous snakes with their bare hands for entertainment. And when they discovered that their local bird population included something called a cassowary, which is basically a 6-foot-tall, feathered murder machine with knife feet, they built walking trails through cassowary habitat and called it ecotourism. Grunt leaned forward with what might have been respect. Australians sound like worthy operatives. The best part, Jake continued, warming to his theme, is that when other humans heard about Australia, instead of quarantining the continent and declaring it a planetary hazard zone, they decided it sounded like a great place to send their criminals, because apparently the logical response to finding a death continent is to use it as a prison. Professor Krelix was taking notes frantically. And the survival rate of these, criminal populations. But he thrived, built cities, started families, invented new types of meat pie. The criminals took one look at a landscape designed by Nightmare and said, yeah, this is fine, let's build a civilization here. And they did. One of the most successful human societies on the planet is built on a foundation of people who looked at continental-scale natural selection and said, bring it on. The classroom had fallen into the kind of stunned silence typically reserved for moments when someone accidentally divides by zero. Even the environmental systems seemed to have paused their humming to process this information. Florp finally managed to speak. They built cities there? Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Brisbane, millions of people living their daily lives, surrounded by enough biological weapons to stock a galactic war. And every morning they wake up, step over the potentially lethal spider in their shower, and go to work. Veltar's form had shifted from skeptical red to a sort of queasy yellow-green. This Austral place, it is considered unusual by human standards, yes? Jake grinned. Australia is not even in the top 5 most dangerous places humans have decided to live. But let's move on from geography, Jake said, settling back into his chair like a professor about to deliver a particularly disturbing lecture. Let's talk about what humans do for fun. Professor Krelix looked up from his furious note-taking. Recreation is typically a low-risk activity designed to reduce stress and promote social bonding. Yeah, about that, Jake said. Humans invented something called base jumping, which is where you throw yourself off a cliff with nothing but a fabric parachute between you and becoming a very messy pancake. Florp made a sound like a deflating balloon. Surely this is some form of ritual suicide. Nope, pure entertainment. We also have free solo rock climbing, where humans scale vertical cliff faces hundreds of feet high with no safety equipment whatsoever. Just their hands, some chalk, and what I can only describe as a complete disregard for the laws of physics and common sense. Veltar's crystalline structure was now pulsing an alarming shade of orange. There must be significant rewards for such behavior. Territory acquisition? Mating rights? The reward is bragging rights, and maybe a video they can post on social media. Oh, and we invented shark cage diving, except some humans thought the cage was too restrictive, so they just swim with the sharks directly. The aliens use armor when fighting dangerous beasts, Grunt rumbled. And coming from a species that considered ritual combat a form of small talk, that was saying something. It gets worse, Jake continued cheerfully. We have something called wingsuit flying, where humans strap fabric wings to their bodies and jump off mountains, flying through narrow canyons at speeds that would make your average spacecraft nervous. The survival rate is exactly what you'd expect, from people voluntarily turning themselves into meat missiles. Professor Krelix's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely. Surely these are isolated cases of individuals with compromised mental faculties. Oh no, Professor. These are organized sports with international competitions. Millions of humans watch them on television, and thousands participate. We literally schedule regular events where people gather to watch other people make catastrophically poor life choices at high speed. Jake paused to take another sip from his questionable beverage container. And then, there's human cuisine. Cuisine? Florp quavered hopefully. Food preparation is typically a nurturing, survival-oriented activity. Humans eat something called ghost peppers. They're peppers so spicy that touching them can cause chemical burns, but we put them in our food on purpose, for flavor. The silence that followed was deafening. We also eat a fish called fugu, that contains enough neurotoxin to kill 30 adult humans. But we consider it a delicacy. The preparation requires special licensing because one wrong cut and everyone at dinner dies, but humans line up and pay premium prices for the privilege. Veltar's form had now achieved a color that didn't exist in most species' visual spectrum. Surely your regulatory agencies intervene. The regulatory agencies? They're the ones who came up with safety standards for gas station sushi. Gas station? Sushi? Professor Krelix asked weakly. Raw fish. Sold at fuel depots by people with no culinary training. Humans will buy it at 3 in the morning and eat it in their vehicles while driving. It's considered convenience food. At this point, Florp had achieved what could only be described as a state of gelatinous shock, wobbling gently in place while making small whimpering sounds. And my personal favorite, Jake said, building to his crescendo. Humans have domesticated wolves, turned them into creatures called dogs, and then bred some of them to be small enough to fit in a purse while simultaneously breeding others to be large enough to mistake for small horses. We invite these descendants of apex predators into our homes and let them sleep in our beds. You keep predators as companions? Grunt asked, and for the first time the massive Thracian warrior actually sounded intimidated. Not just predators. We have people who keep venomous snakes, spiders, and lizards as pets. There are humans whose hobby is collecting the most dangerous creatures they can find and keeping them in glass boxes in their living rooms, for fun. Professor Krelix set down his stylus with a shaking appendage. Mr. Murphy, surely you realize how this sounds to other sapient species? Like we're completely insane? Well, yes. Jake spread his hands. And yet here we are, not only surviving, but thriving, building interstellar civilizations and having casual conversations with beings from across the galaxy. If that's not apex predator behavior, I don't know what is. Jake stood up again, this time with the deliberate movements of someone about to deliver a finishing blow. But you know what really sets humans apart as apex predators? We're the only species in known galactic history to look at the fundamental forces of the universe and say, I bet I can take you. Professor Krelix's compound eyes focused with the intensity of someone watching a particularly fascinating disaster unfold. I'm not certain I follow your logic, Mr. Murphy. Gravity, Jake said simply. Every other species in the galaxy discovered gravity and thought, well, that's a fundamental force of nature, I suppose we'll have to work around it. Humans discovered gravity and immediately started figuring out ways to ignore it. We invented airplanes, helicopters, rockets, and something called parkour, which is basically humans looking at buildings and deciding they're jungle gyms. Veltar's crystalline form was now cycling through colors so rapidly it looked like a malfunctioning disco ball. Overcoming gravity is simply applied physics and engineering. Is it? Because when humans first figured out how to fly, do you know what we did next? We invented air racing. We took the miraculous achievement of defying a universal constant and turned it into a competition to see who could do it the fastest while pulling the most dangerous maneuvers possible. Jake began pacing, warming to his theme. And space travel. Every other species I've met talks about their first ventures into space like it was a careful, methodical process spanning centuries of cautious preparation. As it should be, Professor Krelix interjected. Space is an inherently hostile environment requiring extensive safety protocols. Humans strapped themselves to controlled explosions and shot themselves off the planet barely 60 years after we figured out powered flight. We went from, hey, this thing can get off the ground to, let's see what's on the moon in less time than it takes most species to plan a grocery shopping trip. Florp had somehow managed to achieve an even more liquid state. But surely you took precautions, extensive testing, safety measures. Our safety measures were basically let's try not to explode too much. The first human in space was launched in a metal can with less computing power than a modern toaster. We calculated orbital trajectories with slide rules and prayer. When something went wrong, our backup plan was usually have the astronauts fix it with whatever they can find lying around. Jake paused for effect, taking in the horrified faces of his audience. And when we got to space, did we decide it was too dangerous and establish safe, monitored orbital facilities? No. We built a space station and started doing science experiments in zero gravity. We invented spacewalks, where humans put on pressurized suits and go outside their spacecraft to float around in the vacuum while traveling at 17,000 miles per hour. That actually sounds reasonable for maintenance purposes, Veltar ventured weakly. We also do it for fun. Space tourism is a growing industry. Humans pay money to be launched into space just to experience weightlessness and look at their home planet from orbit. Rich humans compete to see who can stay in space the longest or travel the farthest from Earth. Professor Krelix was taking notes so frantically that his stylus was beginning to smoke. Surely these are exceptional individuals with specialized training? Some of them, sure. But we also have civilians volunteering for one-way trips to Mars, not round trips, one way. They're signing up to leave Earth forever, to live on a frozen desert with no breathable atmosphere, knowing they'll never see home again, and the waiting lists are years long. Jake's voice took on the tone of someone delivering a eulogy for sanity itself. We've sent probes to every planet in our solar system. including ones where the atmospheric pressure would crush most spacecraft, and others where the radiation would sterilize anything organic in seconds. When we found out that Venus has surface temperatures hot enough to melt lead, and atmospheric pressure 90 times greater than Earth's, we didn't say, well, that's clearly uninhabitable. We said, I wonder what it looks like down there, and dropped a probe into hell to take pictures. Grunt leaned forward, his massive frame somehow conveying deep unease. Humans challenge death itself? We don't just challenge death, Grunt. We've turned avoiding death into an art form. We invented medicine by looking at diseases and saying, you know what? No. When we discovered that some illnesses are caused by tiny organisms, we didn't just try to avoid them. We developed ways to kill them, and when they adapted, we made better ways to kill them. We're locked in an eternal arms race with microscopic life forms, and we're winning. Jake's grin had taken on a slightly manic quality. We looked at cancer, one of the most destructive forces in biological systems, and said, we're going to cure this, and we're actually doing it. We're teaching immune systems how to fight more effectively. We're editing genetic code like it's a text document. We've decided that aging itself is just another problem to be solved. The classroom had achieved a level of silence typically found in the depths of space. Even the environmental systems seemed to have given up trying to process what they were hearing. But here's the real kicker, Jake continued, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. We're the only species in galactic history to have weaponized our own extinction. Professor Krellick's antennae went completely still. I beg your pardon? Nuclear weapons. We'd discovered atomic energy, and within a few decades had built enough bombs to sterilize our entire planet several times over. We invented the ability to end our own species, and then spent the next 70 years in a tense standoff, daring each other to push the button first. Sounds like madness, Veltar whispered. It was, and it worked. We were so terrified of our own capacity for destruction that we've spent decades not using it, while simultaneously making sure everyone knows we could if we wanted to. We turned the threat of species suicide into a diplomatic tool. Jake sat back down, his casual demeanor somehow making everything he'd just said even more disturbing. So yeah, Professor, humans might not have the biggest claws or the most venom or the strongest bite force, but we're the only species that looks at the universe itself and says, I bet we can do better. We don't just survive in hostile environments, we turn them into vacation destinations. We don't just avoid danger, we pay money to experience it. And we don't just accept the natural order of things, we rebuild it according to our own completely insane specification. He took another sip from his questionable beverage. If that's not apex predator behavior, I honestly don't know what is. The silence that followed Jake's declaration was so complete that you could have heard a quark sneeze. Professor Krellick sat frozen behind his lectern, all 6 pairs of spectacles reflecting the classroom lights like tiny spotlights of academic terror. His stylus had actually begun to emit small wisps of smoke from the friction of his frantic note-taking. Finally, after what felt like several geological epochs, Professor Krellick cleared his throat with a sound like grinding gears. Mr. Murphy, he began, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just watched their entire world view get fed through a paper shredder, I must admit that your argument is both the most disturbing and most compelling presentation I have encountered in 47 years of teaching xenobiology. Veltar's crystalline form had achieved a color that could best be described as existential crisis purple. I find myself unable to refute the human's logic, despite every rational instinct screaming that it should be impossible. The evidence is overwhelming, Professor Krellick continued, consulting his smoking tablet. A species that not only survives but actively seeks out danger, turning environmental hazards into recreational activities, weaponizing their own extinction, and somehow managing to thrive through what can only be described as weaponized stupidity. Florp had reformed into something resembling a very traumatized puddle. They eat poison for fun, she whispered to herself. They jump off cliffs with fabric parachutes. They keep predators as pets. They turned their death continent into a tourist destination. Humans are terrifying, Grunt announced with something that might have been respect, or might have been abject horror. It was hard to tell with Thracians. They fight the universe itself and win through sheer refusal to accept defeat. Professor Krellick nodded slowly. Indeed. I hereby award Mr. Murphy the highest marks for this assignment. His thesis that apex predator status can be achieved through catastrophically poor decision-making combined with inexplicable survival rates is not only valid, but represents a fundamental shift in how we understand evolutionary success. Jake beamed like a student who had just aced the final exam of advanced quantum stupidity. Thanks, Professor. I have to admit, I wasn't sure how well the argument would land with a non-human audience. Your presentation has been illuminating, Veltar managed, their form slowly cycling back toward a more normal blue. Though I must ask, surely your examples were somewhat exaggerated for effect? Surely humans don't actually engage in such behavior on a regular basis? Jake glanced at his chronometer and winced. Actually, speaking of poor life choices, I should probably mention why I was late to class today. Professor Krelix's antennae perked up with the kind of morbid curiosity typically reserved for watching traffic accidents in slow motion. Oh? Yeah, so the space station has this new recreational facility, right? It's got these observation decks with these amazing views of the local star system. Really beautiful stuff. Jake took another sip of his mysterious beverage, completely oblivious to the growing alarm on his classmates' faces. And, Florf asked, though her tone suggested she really didn't want to know. Well, they also installed these emergency airlocks for maintenance access to the exterior hull. You know, for repairs and stuff. Jake's grin was taking on that particular quality that every teacher learns to recognize as the prelude to a disciplinary incident. Veltar's form flared bright red. Please tell me you did not do what I think you are about to say you did. Look, the sign said authorized personnel only, not don't bungee jump off the space station. Technically, I wasn't violating any specific regulations. The classroom erupted into chaos. Professor Krelix made a sound like a malfunctioning air recycling unit. Florp achieved a state of gelatinous hysteria that shouldn't have been physically possible. Even Grunt recoiled, in what might have been horror or admiration. You jumped off the space station, Grunt bellowed. With what safety equipment? Oh, I had safety equipment. I borrowed some maintenance cables from the engineering deck and rigged up a makeshift harness. It was perfectly safe. Maintenance cables are not designed for recreational use, Grunt roared, which, coming from a species that considered gladiatorial combat a form of therapy, was particularly concerning. Baby held, didn't they? Plus, the view was incredible. You can see 3 different nebulae from the bottom of the swing arc. Professor Krelix was now clicking his mandibles so rapidly it sounded like a percussion section having a seizure. Mr. Murphy, do you realize that you could have died? That you could have damaged the station? That you violated approximately 47 different safety regulations? Probably, Jake agreed cheerfully. But it was awesome. I'm thinking of trying it again this weekend, maybe with a longer cable so I can get closer to the asteroid field. The asteroid field is a navigation hazard, Grunt pointed out with the kind of emphasis typically reserved for explaining why jumping into active volcanoes is considered poor planning. Right. Which is why it would be so cool to bungee jump through it. Think about the photos. The silence that followed was the kind of silence typically associated with the heat death of the universe. Finally, Veltar spoke, their voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose faith in rational thought had just been murdered in broad daylight. You are going to do it again, aren't you? Probably. I've got the harness figured out now, and Jenkins from engineering said he knows where I can get some better cables. More elastic, should give me a really good bounce. Professor Krelix slowly removed all 6 pairs of his spectacles, and began cleaning them with the mechanical precision of someone whose world had just been fundamentally reorganized. Class dismissed, he said weakly. I need to update my curriculum, possibly my insurance forms, definitely my understanding of evolutionary biology. As the other students filed out, giving Jake the kind of wide berth typically reserved for unexploded ordnance, Veltar paused at the doorway. Human Jake, they said, their crystalline form pulsing with reluctant respect. I concede your point about poor life choices defining apex predators. Thanks, Veltar. That means a lot. However, I feel compelled to point out that your species' approach to survival is completely insane. Jake grinned and raised his questionable beverage in a toast. And yet, here we are, having conquered interstellar travel and making friends with crystalline beings from across the galaxy. If that's not apex predator success, I don't know what is. As Veltar left, shaking their crystalline head in defeat, Jake turned to Professor Krelix, who was still mechanically cleaning his spectacles. So, Professor, same time next week? I'm thinking of doing my next presentation on human approaches to diplomacy. Did you know we once ended a war by playing a soccer match? Professor Krelix's mandibles stopped clicking entirely. In the sudden silence, he slowly looked up at Jake with the expression of someone who had just realized that things could, in fact, get much worse. Mr. Murphy, he said quietly, perhaps we should discuss independent study options. Jake's grin widened. awesome. I've got some great ideas about human recreational activities in zero-gravity environments. Somewhere in the distance, an emergency alarm began to sound. Jake glanced toward the window, where maintenance crews were apparently investigating some kind of unauthorized equipment modification near the station's exterior airlocks. "Ha," Jake said, finishing his drink. "I should probably go talk to them about that. See you next week, Professor." As Jake left the classroom, Professor Krelix sat alone among his notes, staring at 47 years of carefully organized xenobiological data that had just been completely revolutionized by a human with a coffee stain on his shirt, and a complete disregard for the basic principles of self-preservation. He made one final note in his tablet. Revision required. Apex predators may be defined not by evolutionary advantages but by sheer, inexplicable refusal to acknowledge that anything is actually dangerous. Then he set down his stylus, put his head in his hands, and wondered if it was too late to change careers, maybe something safe and predictable, like quantum mechanics or temporal paradox theory. Outside the classroom, Jake was already explaining to a very concerned maintenance chief why borrowing station cables for recreational purposes had seemed like a good idea at the time, while simultaneously planning his next adventure. After all, someone had mentioned that the station's new gravitational research lab had some interesting equipment that might work well for indoor skydiving. The universe, it seemed, had not yet finished being terrorized by humanity's approach to the concept of fun.